Donc, nous reprenons nos travaux et nous accueillons maintenant le professeur Tim Stainton. Bienvenue, professeur, et merci d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Je vous cède la parole dès maintenant.
Merci, Madame Chairman. Bonjour, Mesdames et Messieurs, et merci de cette invitation à votre rencontre aujourd'hui. Unfortunately, my French is very limited, so I will need to continue in English. Very pleased to be with you today from the lands of the Tawasin people on the south coast of British Columbia. Very early in the day, I might add, for me. I've provided a written brief which gives more detail of what I'm going to discuss today, and but I wanted to share with you some of the key points. It's a little bit about my background. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work at the University of British Columbia, and the co-founder and director of the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship, which focuses on issues around intellectual disability and various social and ethical aspects related to that. My main expertise is really in the area of service design, delivery, and evaluation, as well as issues around ethics and history of approaches to intellectual disability. I should add that I'm also the father of a young adult with an intellectual disability, so that certainly influences my perspective. So I'd like to begin just by outlining some of the key concerns of the disability community and then move on to a brief discussion around intellectual disabilities particularly. So I think the concerns of the disability community are well known. Recently in the debate around Bill C7 in the federal parliament, over 140 disability organizations from across the country signed a letter expressing their concern around the introduction of C7. And this concern was shared formerly by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of People with Disabilities, Devandas Aguilar, who after her visit to Canada was extremely concerned about the implications of assisted dying legislation on people with disabilities after hearing multiple complaints. And she urged the federal government to investigate these complaints and put into place adequate safeguards to ensure that persons with disabilities do not request assisted dying simply because of the absence of community-based alternatives. This was echoed by her successor, Gerard Quinn, in the hearings on C7, and he was joined in his concern with the independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by older persons and the special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. So I think the concerns are very real and shared by others. And it is, for me, it's difficult to imagine a piece of legislation passing that was so universally opposed by the group, by an equity-seeking group, and by so many UN experts on human rights. And I think that really highlighted the frustration of the disability community in terms of having their voices heard and taken seriously in the debate on medical assistance in dying. So I'm going to outline some of the key concerns. The main concern is really this issue of MAiD as a substitute for acceptable disability supports. And unfortunately, we've had a number of cases now that have gone public. Archie Roland, who died by MAiD, was cited in the Montreal Gazette that it's not the illness that's killing him. He's tired of fighting for compassionate care. Monsieur Touchon, in fact, the plaintiff in the recent Quebec case at a news conference, had his assistant read a statement that he couldn't face the prospect of a life confined to institution. So clearly his motivation to seek the right to access MAiD was a social one as much as a inherent to his disability. 41-year-old Sean Taggart, a man who lived on Vancouver Island who died by MAiD. He was very clear that he chose MAiD because he was unable to secure sufficient home care hours to allow him to remain in his home where he could be with his young son, and the alternative of moving to an institution was unacceptable to him. And finally, in Quebec, Jonathan Marchand, in his protesting for additional care, he set out quite eloquently in his testimony to the Senate, "I was prepared to do anything to get out of this medical hell, but just like Jean Touchon, I was denied home care support that I needed. After 2.5 years in hospital, I ended up in a long-term care facility. I gave up and sank into depression. I was ashamed to live in this ghetto. Without humanity and freedom, life no longer has any meaning. I regretted having refused euthanasia. I simply wanted to live with my partner, work, and have a normal social life. My disability is not the cause of my suffering, but rather the lack of adequate support, accessibility, and the discrimination I endure every day. Why is it so hard to be seen and heard when we want to live?" So I think it's fairly clear why some people with disabilities are seeking MAiD, and it's really a structural problem in terms of being able to access the kind of supports they require. Currently, there are over 18,000 people in Quebec between the ages of 18 and 64 living in healthcare and related facilities, and some 5,000 in nursing homes, seniors facilities, including 1,325 under the age of 50. In the field, in much of my work involves designing and setting up and advising on disability support systems. And the gold standard now is for people to have as much control over those supports through things like direct funding and home-based supports. And really, we know now that there is no level of disability that we can't accommodate within an adapted home environment within the community. So the reason younger people are being institutionalized is not due to their disability, but due to structural and policy and financial constraints. Add to this that disabled people are one of the most marginalized in the country. Roughly 29% of working age adults with disabilities are living in poverty, and suicide and suicidal ideation are strongly correlated with economic deprivation. Add to this, they are far more likely to be victims of violence than Canadians without disabilities, particularly women and those with mental health disabilities. Poor access to appropriate housing and high rates of institutionalization and poor access to disability supports add to this general picture that being disabled in Canada is not one conducive to living a full and meaningful life. Due to the absence of full supports, many people are dependent on their family or their caregivers. And we know from both the Canadian data and data from other jurisdictions that feelings of burdensomeness are a key driver for people to seek access to medical assistance in dying. So the risk of opting for MAiD rather than continuing to struggle against many of the barriers disabled people face in trying to live a meaningful and fulfilling life is not one that could be lightly dismissed. This risk is arguably heightened in the context of austerity and concern with rising health and social care costs. In their submission to the UN Human Rights Commission, the major Canadian disability rights organizations note that under Article 16 has recognized the rights of persons with disabilities to effective enjoyment of the right to life on an equal basis with others. States are required to provide measures of protection to guarantee this right, including the provision of reasonable accommodation when necessary to ensure the right to life, such as ensuring access of persons to essential facilities and services. And I think it's fair to say Canada is somewhat behind in meeting its expectation on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I'd like to switch to the second major concern, which is slightly more esoteric, but it involves how disabled people are viewed in society and the general negative valuation of disabled lives within Canadian society. Tough Rewind, who I understand is your next witness, notes that numerous reports in recent years have suggested that the lives of people with intellectual disabilities are valued less across society and that their short life expectancy results from inappropriate, value-laden decision-making by healthcare professionals. And there have been a number of studies that have shown preventable deaths have been caused generally by a failure to treat people with intellectual disabilities in the way they would others. There have been numerous studies around health attitudes in healthcare. Gill reviewed several studies to find there's a general negative valuation of disabled lives in healthcare settings, and in fact, in some circumstances, was more negative than in the general population. A recent study out of Harvard interviewed 714 practicing U.S. physicians and found that 82.4% felt that disabled people had significantly worse quality of life than non-disabled people. And they note that these findings about physicians' perceptions of this population raise questions about ensuring equitable care. Potentially biased views amongst physicians could contribute to persistent health disparities affecting people with disabilities. There are other disturbing examples of the intersection of health and disability. Excuse me. If we look at issues around prenatal testing and neonatal euthanasia, we find similar scenarios where it's poor quality of life for neonatal euthanasia. Significantly, people with spina bifida are euthanized as neonates. And the American College of Pediatricians notes that there's much room for parental, physician, personal, and social and economic bias in decisions around neonatal euthanasia. And it's not a stretch to think that similar considerations may influence the practice of MAiD. In terms of ethics, we may think, well, the ethical systems will protect people with disabilities from undue access to MAiD. In fact, we see streams of ethics, predominantly utilitarian streams, which is a major ethical system used in healthcare, are actually openly hostile to the interests of people with disabilities. This largely stems from a direct equating of disability with suffering. John Harris, a leading UK bioethicist, writes with regard to prenatal testing, where we know that a particular individual will be born deformed or disfigured, the powerful motive we had is to avoid bringing gratuitous suffering into the world. Will show us to do so would be wrong. He goes on to state that in the case of severe disability, we should give them a humane death by legalizing euthanasia in such cases. So I think it's important to note that he's not just arguing this is okay. He's arguing that we have a moral duty to eliminate disabled persons if they're presumed to be suffering. Free Winge notes the fact that disability itself, rather than an acquired medical condition, can be accepted as the cause of suffering justifies euthanasia is deeply worrying. There's inherent negative bias towards disability and disabled lives within healthcare and some ethical norms of systems. It's not difficult to imagine a scenario where disabled people are counseled or even encouraged to consider MAiD. This is particularly concerning with regards to newly disabled persons or those experiencing prolonged mental health challenges. Not surprisingly, people who experience traumatic injury resulting in disability go through a period of despair and helplessness, but studies have consistently showing that over time they do adjust if they're provided with the appropriate mental health and disability-related supports. However, generally, this would be a period of years rather than months. So I think this all points to the risk that the mere 90-day waiting period suggested in the, or now in the new federal law, is far too short to avoid premature suicides in these cases. So I'd like to just now switch to looking specifically at intellectual and developmental disabilities and the question of consent. Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities confirms that all disabled people have a right to make decisions and to be supported as required. And this is generally something that I support. However, in the context of MAiD, we need to take note that many people with intellectual disabilities have a tendency to want to agree. This is well established in the literature. They want to please, or they have been living in situations where agreement with those in power is an important aspect to survival. So that in the context of family or support workers and healthcare professionals that feel they may be better off accessing MAiD rather than undergoing a life-saving treatment or medical intervention, we may well not be sure that their agreement to MAiD is a true expression of their will and preference. Another concern is as we open up the question of substitute decision-making, which is really what it comes down to with an advance directive. Someone else is going to have to make the decision on MAiD at the time of administration. We've begun to open a door around substitute consent, which is very concerning for people with intellectual disabilities. Unfortunately, there are numerous cases of both murder of children with disabilities, as well as murder-suicide of families that can no longer cope. So in the context of MAiD, if they're allowed to consent on the person's behalf, we may well see significant number of cases that follow that pattern. A recent case, well, a number of years ago, case in the news of Madame Corriveau wanted the right to euthanize 2 of her children with severe disabilities. This was a very broad public presentation in Canada, as well as on the Dr. Phil show, and received resounding support from the public for her right to have her children euthanized. So all of this suggests significant risks if the MAiD laws become increasingly permissive. So to conclude, well, the expansion of MAiD has been motivated by a desire to end suffering and respect autonomy. In doing so, we've created significant risks to persons with disabilities. The legal debate on MAiD has always been about balancing individuals' right to decide how to end their own life and protecting the vulnerable. It's my opinion that that balance has now shifted to a dangerous imbalance that creates extreme risk for some people with disabilities, and they will die not out of a desire to end their life, but out of desperation or despair from a lack of supports which would allow them to live a life of dignity. They'll be increasingly victims of worldviews that they are less valuable. So I guess for me, the question is, are we willing to sacrifice the lives of some disabled citizens to ensure a broad right for the majority population to access MAiD when and how they choose? Well, I'd like to offer suggestions or safeguards that might protect against this. In my view, Canadian law has passed the point where safeguards can fully protect disabled persons. Some things that may help are the elimination of disabilities as standalone eligibility criteria, extended timelines for those who are not at the end of life, more rigorous evaluation of consent and capacity for persons with intellectual disabilities, a strict prohibition on substitute consent, and detailed psychosocial assessment, active remediation of unmet needs, and disability supports all may lessen the risk. In my view, it's imperative we step back and take a look seriously at the issues around disability and vulnerable persons. It's no longer hyperbole that we are at risk of uncritically heading to a place where the phrase better dead than disabled becomes an underlying, if unspoken, driver of policy and practice. Thank you for your time today and giving me the opportunity to meet with you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Stainton. Professeur Stainton, vous nous entendez toujours bien?
Put un moment, s'il vous plaît. I've lost the phone connection, so I'll just need to connect again.
On va suspendre quelques instants, professeur Stainton, le temps là, que vous vous reconnectiez via le téléphone. Encore, OK. On revient, excusez. Nous sommes maintenant en ondes. Merci, professeur Stainton. Donc, je me risque pour une question. Tout à l'heure, on a entendu le professeur Cahouette qui nous a indiqué qu'il y a des moyens d'avoir le consentement des personnes avec des difficultés ou certains handicaps, dont les autistes, certains types. Vous voyez ça comment, ces moyens-là, pour avoir un consentement de ces personnes-là?
Well, it's a difficult question to generalize on because, of course, autism and intellectual disability is an extremely broad spectrum in terms of impact with, you know, many people would basically, you would approach it as you would with anyone else. For those with more severe disabilities, the general standard now is through some form of supported decision making, where someone who is generally seen to have a relationship of trust with the person is empowered not to speak for them, but to be the person who interprets their will and preference to us. In the context of MAiD, as I mentioned, that is I think a dangerous proposition. So I really think you almost need a highly individualized process and consent. But I think Professor Tuffrey Wayne, who you have next, is probably better able to answer that question than me.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais céder la parole au député de Chamédé.
May I raise some question in English? Thank you, Professor Stainton, to be with us today. Okay, I will have two quick questions for you, if you don't mind. The first one will be about the suggestion that you made in your brief. And because I'm a little bit preoccupied by your conclusion that we shift to a dangerous imbalance, do you think that some of the suggestions that you made may help us reach a balance and can be really positive for that the disabled person in that field of activity. And my second question will be about minors. I'd like to have your opinion about MAiD regarding minors under 18, if you have an opinion regarding that.
Okay, thank you. So I think in terms of the imbalance, as I mentioned, I think the suggestions, and there are probably other things that could help. I don't think, as long as we still have a society that's largely, hostile to people with disabilities, and we don't provide the appropriate supports, I'm not sure there is a completely safe approach to MAiD. I do think some of those will help. I think perhaps the most important one would be the removal of disability as one of the categories. That it's rather odd when you think about it. You have the grievous and irremediable disease or illness, but you also have disability. And being disabled doesn't mean you're sick. So they're the only group that can actually access MAiD without being ill. So to me, that would probably be the most important safeguard, is if we eliminated that category, which would not eliminate people with disabilities who are ill from accessing MAiD. It would simply eliminate the possibility of people with intellectual disabilities and others accessing it really due to despair or desperation. I think certainly the extended wait time would help in terms of people with mental health difficulties or having experienced a traumatic injury. Anyone that's gone through depression or anxiety knows that it lasts an awful lot longer than 90 days. And during that period, it's very common, suicidal ideation stuff, and that can sadly last years, not months. So in terms of mature minors, it's not an area that I focus on, so I don't have an overly informed opinion, so I wouldn't want to claim an expert opinion. I think it's a dangerous road to start down. As you continue to open the door wider and wider. And, we've seen in other jurisdictions, relatively young people accessing MAiD due to, they weren't a mature minor, but due to surgery to transition genders. Despair from that. We've recently had a case of a younger woman with autism or diagnosed with autism where, there was some suggestion it was really just her being depressed at a breakup with a boyfriend. So to me, I think we'd have to be very, very careful with mature minors. But as I say, it's not an area I claim any great expertise on.
Thank you, Mr.
Merci.
Stainton.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le député. Donc, je céderai maintenant la parole au député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Thank you, Mr. Stainton. Tout à l'heure, vous avez abordé une partie de votre présentation concernant les gens, je crois, qui sont aux prises avec des cancers en phase terminale et qui souffrent aussi de déficiences ou qui sont atteints de déficiences intellectuelles. J'aimerais ça un peu que vous rentrez un petit peu plus dans les détails. De quelle façon voyez-vous le consentement par rapport à ces gens-là au niveau de l'aide médicale à mourir? Et est-ce que les balises devraient être les mêmes que des gens qui sont atteints de cancer en phase terminale, mais qui n'ont pas de déficience intellectuelle?
I think just from a human rights perspective, the standards should be the same. Absolutely. The methods, however, I think would need to be significantly adapted. And I'm not sure there is a way to ever be conclusive with some people, particularly people who can't communicate through formal means, who don't have expressive language. So there would, basically to me, it's a question of uncertainty. So, you know, if you or I make that decision, and we make it over time, and we consider it, and we discuss it with people, you know, we can be relatively sure that's a true expression of our will. Someone that may have more difficulty conceptualizing, understanding what the issues are, that's going to increase the degree of uncertainty whether their consent is a true expression of their will. And then that's increased again once that will is being interpreted through a different person. So again, I don't think there is a one size fits all. But for me, the worry is as soon as you move away from that, so that if you like paradigmatic understanding of consent, you introduce uncertainty, and you will never absolutely know if this was the true will and preference of that person.
OK. Tout à l'heure, on a eu un intervenant qui a mentionné qu'une personne avec une déficience intellectuelle devrait avoir accès à l'aide médicale à mourir, et la déficience intellectuelle ne doit pas être une raison pour ne pas avoir droit à l'aide médicale à mourir. Et c'est dans ce cas-là, dans le cas justement où une personne, entre autres, pourrait être atteinte d'une maladie neurodégénérative, exemple de type Alzheimer, puis qu'elle souhaite faire aussi une demande anticipée d'aide médicale à mourir en vue des derniers stades de la maladie. Mais selon vous, là, son handicap intellectuel influencerait-il vraiment son aptitude à consentir? Parce que vous dites dans vos propos que c'est difficile de savoir vraiment ce que la personne en pense, mais on sait que ces gens-là, des fois, souffrent aussi, entre autres ceux qui ont la maladie d'Alzheimer. Mais dans ces cas-là, comment qu'on fait? Comment voyez-vous ça, Monsieur Stainton?
Again, well, I think the first statement is, you know, absolutely any right that any Canadian has, a Canadian with an intellectual disability should also have. And I would never suggest otherwise. The problem again is around A, how do we know it's their true will and preference, and B, is there coercive factors around them? And so the only way you're going to know that is to do a fairly in-depth psychosocial assessment, talk to people around them, get some independent information, and ultimately I would be more comfortable if it's a more legal decision than a medical decision. So whether that's a tribunal that would review the consent procedures and had the capacity to investigate the nature of that would provide a greater degree of security. But I think the problem comes in terms of how the disease or illness that the person might be seeking MAiD for is interpreted in healthcare. So we have ample examples of people, for instance, being refused routine operations or suggested they don't have a routine operation because they have an intellectual disability. Quite a number of years ago, there was the Dawson case out here in British Columbia where he needed and he was a man with significant disabilities, intellectual and otherwise. He needed a fairly standard back operation to replace the shunt as he grew. Not a minor operation, but one that's fairly common and low risk. The parents wanted to refuse consent and let him die at that point. And the courts ruled that he should have the same access. So that's where it gets tricky. So would the interpretation of the illness be the same as it would be for a person without an intellectual disability? So again, that's why I think you need a very rigorous and relatively independent of healthcare process.
Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le député. Je passerai maintenant la parole à ma collègue de Soulanges.
Bonjour, professeur Stainton. J'espère que je parle assez fort. J'ai une question par rapport à votre document que vous nous avez envoyé. Vous mentionnez que le retrait du consentement final aurait un impact démesuré sur les personnes atteintes de déficience intellectuelle, considérant le niveau d'incertitude qui caractérise la vraie volonté de la personne au moment de l'administration. Que suggérez-vous comme balise afin de s'assurer que les personnes soient protégées? Est-ce que vous pensez qu'un retour systématique aux tribunaux afin de valider l'aptitude à consentir serait plutôt une solution qu'au simple personnel médical qui serait une alternative?
Thank you for that question. I think, just adding to what I've said, the issue is that you will never eliminate uncertainty. As soon as you move away from a contemporaneous consent, you're going to have uncertainty. And to be honest, that's why, from my perspective, I think it's very dangerous to move away from contemporaneous consent. I think less so in the current formulation where it's a very short term, so that 10 days when the person has gone through the procedures have been approved and may lose capacity in that short period. I think once you move into extended advance directives, your level of uncertainty is going to get to a point where I think it's unacceptable. We know that a significant portion of people approved for assisted suicide in other jurisdictions at the end choose not to follow that through. So I think that suggests to us that simply having an advance directive made several years ago doesn't necessarily mean that's what you would do at the moment. So for me, I don't think there is a way to eliminate the uncertainty, and I personally believe it's very dangerous to move much away from that. I will say I was a member of the Council of Canadian Academies review of MAiD that instituted by the federal government, and I sat on the Advance Directive Committee. And though there was a very broad range of opinions on that committee, I think the report makes clear that there was no belief that uncertainty could be eliminated.
Merci. Thank you.
Thank you.
Parfait. Une question rapide, Monsieur le député de Mégantic, pour 2 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Hi, Professor Stainton. It's a pleasure today. Je veux revenir encore sur you talk about more security if all the people go to the tribunal. Donc, ce que vous dites, c'est à chaque cas, il faudrait que les cas aillent au tribunal pour pouvoir bénéficier de l'aide médicale à mourir. Est-ce que c'est ça? Puis, est-ce que c'est un tribunal qui serait unique pour ces cas-là ou ça y passerait vraiment par la cour?
I don't think they would need to go to the court. I mean, I think there would be that option if say a public guardian or someone had serious concerns, but I think it would be something more like a mental health tribunal. So a tribunal set up specifically for this that had, members drawn from the community and professions who had expertise in the area and provided the reviews. So more like a labor tribunal or a mental health tribunal kind of approach rather than the courts per se. Okay. This incidentally was recommended in the original MAiD debate by the Vulnerable Person Standard, which is the kind of coalition of organizations of vulnerable persons in terms of reviewing applications for MAiD. It was not taken up at that time, but I think as we expand, and particularly as when mental health becomes the underlying concern, I strongly believe that a lot more rigor is needed. And so that's one way that could be done.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le député. Je céderai la parole maintenant à la députée de Westmount-Saint-Louis.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Good morning, Professor Stainton. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I think that you'll find that the commission members to whom you're presenting today are very sensitive to the cause of individuals that are handicapped or who suffer from an intellectual disability. I found it very difficult to hear better dead than disabled as a parent of 2 children that are handicapped. I think I preach life is worth living. And so I understand the perspective that you shared with us today. So as a parent, I'd like to understand from your perspective, assuming that there was going to be an extension of MAiD and we were to include individuals that were intellectually handicapped, deficient, what training would you like to see within the network to ensure that these individuals, and we can get to the idea of consent. I know you've talked a lot about consent. We're talking a lot about self-determination and making sure that the rights apply to everybody, as you've mentioned earlier. What type of training do you think would be required to ensure that there's a proper understanding?
Thanks for that question. Appreciate your perspective. I think first it's important to acknowledge that people with intellectual disabilities are eligible for MAiD so long as they can consent. There's no prohibition there, and that's part of my concern. And in terms of training, really it's somewhat broad-based, but I'll use an example from, as you're probably aware, that there's been concerns in the intellectual disability community around prenatal testing and, the roughly 90% elimination of fetuses with Down syndrome. And there was concern that many of the training programs for genetic counseling weren't addressing disability issues. So they've actually made some progress. I work with our genetic counseling program at UBC to provide background around disability rights, disability theory. Most people are not aware of the rather dire socio-demographics of disabled people. So I think sharing those kind of things. Programs, our program, and I think a number of others, have a kind of navigator program where all their students are linked up with the person in a family with Down syndrome, and they need to spend time with them and talk to them and get a sense. So they're not talking about a genetic variation. They're talking about human beings and people, and understand that that's as rich and robust and wonderful as any other human being, right? So I think that would help, but I'm not. Med schools at the moment have very little content on disability other than the medical aspects. And so generally are not well informed about the sociological aspects of disability. So if we could improve that may help. I think younger physicians generally are somewhat better informed. So, but to be honest, I think the sort of what we would call ableism is so deeply entrenched and to a large degree unknown and unacknowledged. We talk a lot lately of unconscious bias around race. I think that's exactly the same and possibly even deeper with disability. And that's not easy to train out of someone.
So you talk about ableism, and then I guess this is where I have a disconnect, where if we're talking about ableism, we want to ensure that people that suffer from intellectual disabilities or autism or handicaps have the ability to self-determine their fate, because we view them as having an ability, if the individual can prove that they have given their consent. And I understand that we require certain parameters to get that done. I've heard some of your recommendations where you've mentioned perhaps extended timelines, rigorous evaluations, that maybe there needs to be a separate tribunal. Is there something in your, because you are a specialist, you've studied this to some degree, how do we identify then the suffering for somebody that is disabled or suffers from an intellectual handicap, given the fact that we don't want to give access to MAiD because of their intellectual disability, right? We don't want the lack of services or the lack of care to be the reason why people are gaining access. And so we're thinking that it has to be based on suffering, on some form of mental illness, on the fact that I am suffering. How do we identify that for somebody that has an intellectual disability or who suffers from autism, for example?
Yeah, I think, I think it's difficult to fully identify for anybody, to be honest. But I think there is an additional risk here. A question we don't emphasize in this process is we ask people to acknowledge that they're suffering intolerably. What we often don't ask is why, and then interrogate that deeper in terms of the causes of those suffering and whether they can be ameliorated. In the new law, there's a bit of I think, a throwaway line around doctors must advise about disability supports or ask them about that. To be honest, most doctors are not particularly well informed about community supports and community services and disability supports. So I think interrogating more deeply why. And one of the problems we have is that even if, say, okay, well, so as in the case of Roland or Touchon or Taggart or Foley, if we had the capacity to say, okay, we will approve your home care sufficient that you can live the life you want to live. And they've been quite explicit that's the cause of their MAiD. We have no capacity to do that, right? Theoretically we could, but it's also problematic that one is, federal law and the other is provincial jurisdiction. And I didn't spell out here, but I think, there's a very strong risk that healthcare resources will become part of the decision-making process around advising people around MAiD. Sorry, I'm not sure that answered your question fully, but
I think we all got the message that we understand that we need to rethink the type of services that we're offering people that are handicapped, regardless of what the handicap is, because devaluing or establishing a negative bias toward them is certainly not the direction that anybody wants to go in. But if we bring it back to MAiD, and for example, what I guess I'm wanting to know from you is if there was an assumption that there would be a recommendation that we say it should apply to individuals that for an anticipated request, for example, so that person can self-determine what they wish to have their life be or not be in the future in the event that the person isn't intellectually handicapped or suffers from autism or has a handicap. What do we need to do to adapt the process for them so that it is not exclusionary, so that we can practice ableism, so that it can be an inclusive process? What would that look like for that individual? And I'm hoping that you're going to give us some gleans of information, given the fact that we've had other experts pass in this committee who have shared with us that BC has a center of excellence, and that's something that we could perhaps inspire ourselves from in terms of processes that we could put in place here going forward.
Yeah, again, I guess I'd go back to, I think an independent process like a tribunal would help, but I think probably most critically is this kind of ability to undertake a more comprehensive psychosocial assessment by, a social worker or somebody trained in that who could spend the time. And to be honest, it's a bit of a reverse planning process. So that's actually how I started my career, was doing these kind of plans for people to come out of institutions. And I needed the capacity to spend time with people, to spend time with their families, to get to know their lives, to understand what they wanted and what they didn't want, to really get a sense of their preferences. So I think that kind of capacity in the system would be critical.
So somebody that's a specialist, let's say, that specializes specifically in end-of-life care for individuals. It's exactly what Professor Cahouette just shared with us. The previous presenter, he said that he felt that this could be a specialized role that could be introduced into the system, somebody who could accompany the families and the individual to better understand and to help that individual understand the consent that they're giving and what the process is.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it an end-of-life specialist. I think you want someone with a deep understanding of intellectual disability and really more a life specialist than end-of-life, so they can evaluate the motivations and whether, actually, if that's what's really the problem, we can look at XYZ solution. Would that be something you'd consider before this other? So it's that kind of iterative, deeply engaged, individualized process that I think is there. And that's not a doctor, it's not a healthcare role, it's a social care role.
And how much...
Merci beaucoup, Madame la députée. C'est tout le temps que nous avions.
Thank you.
Donc, je céderai la parole maintenant au député de Gouin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Bonjour, Professeur Stainton. Merci beaucoup de votre présentation d'aujourd'hui. Je vais vous poser une question assez directe. La plupart des représentation que vous nous avez faite aujourd'hui était faite en référence à la loi fédérale sur l'aide médicale à mourir. Comme vous savez, les travaux de notre commission ici portent sur la loi québécoise sur l'aide médicale à mourir et sur ses potentielles évolutions. La loi fédérale, il y a une différence majeure entre la loi fédérale actuelle et la loi québécoise. La loi québécoise, au moment où on se parle, est très claire au fait, à son article 26, qu'il faut être atteint d'une maladie grave et incurable pour être admissible à l'aide médicale à mourir. La notion d'handicap n'apparaît pas dans la loi québécoise, contrairement à la loi fédérale. Ma question serait, dans quelle mesure vos recommandations s'appliquent à la loi québécoise? Avez-vous des recommandations à nous faire spécifiquement sur la loi québécoise? Et je vous précise au passage qu'au moment où on se parle, la Commission n'a pas reçu de témoignages ou de représentations qui recommandent de créer une nouvelle catégorie d'admissibilité à l'aide médicale à mourir qui serait basée uniquement sur une situation d'handicap intellectuel ou autre par ailleurs. Donc, ce n'est pas jusqu'à maintenant des représentations que nous avons reçues. Donc, cette précision faite, qu'est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire sur la loi québécoise sur l'aide médicale à mourir? Est-ce que vous avez des recommandations qui s'y appliquent spécifiquement?
Thank you for that. And I do apologize. I'm not particularly familiar with the Quebec law per se, so I don't want to overstep my expertise. I think not having the specific disability designation is a good thing. The problems will come in disaggregating disability and illness because they're often conflated, right? So I think you will need clarity in terms of what do we mean by illness or disease. So, you know, being paraplegic is not an illness per se. It's a disability that's occurred, but people will also often have related health issues, so that their motivation may be related to the kind of social conditions I mentioned around being disabled, but the justification will use the specific health issue. I think the case of degenerative conditions is probably, and to be honest, I think that's where the motivation for opening MAiD up and the disability side comes from. It is a somewhat different proposition, but again, those folks would be covered on the illness side or the disease side. So I think you're going to have to be vigilant in terms of that those barriers don't start to weaken between disease and disability. Unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with the Quebec Act, so I don't want to say too much that may not be relevant.
Merci beaucoup. Je vous relance sur un élément parce que c'est intéressant. Vous nous dites, attention, la frontière entre l'handicap et la maladie n'est peut-être pas aussi étanche que l'on croit. Comment on pourrait, à votre avis, moderniser la loi québécoise pour éviter les périls que vous nous signalez sur le plan de la protection des personnes vulnérables, sans non plus créer une nouvelle discrimination qui dirait si vous avez un handicap, vous n'êtes pas éligible. Parce que ça, j'ai bien compris que ce n'est pas votre volonté de dire qu'une personne avec handicap devrait, parce qu'elle a un handicap, automatiquement être exclue. Donc, comment on trouve l'équilibre entre, donc, éviter le glissement dont vous venez de parler de la maladie vers l'handicap, tout en ne discriminant pas en soi les gens qui ont un handicap d'avoir accès à l'aide médicale à mourir?
Yeah, it's a good question and not one with an easy answer, as I'm sure you're aware. you know, in terms of defining disability, and I'm sure many members are aware of this, that disability is now generally defined from a social perspective, not a medical. So it's really about the social barriers, limitations, participatory limits that people experience due to an impairment, like paraplegia or intellectual disability. And that's fairly well established. It's basically the definition used in the new Accessible Canada Act. It's the definition that is used for the census, the former PAL survey, the Canadian Disability Survey. We're really looking at this activity and participation limitation. So I think spelling that out is useful, and emphasizing that the only area of qualification would be the impairment, not the disability. The impairment being the biomedical phenomenon.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, professeur Stainton. C'est tout le temps que nous avions avec le député de Gouin. Je vous demanderais peut-être, on ne vous voit plus, on voit seulement qu'un gros halo de soleil. Peut-être fermez votre rideau ou vous tassez un peu. On vous voit mieux, ça va mieux comme ça. Parfait, merci beaucoup. Donc, je passerai la parole maintenant à ma collègue Joliette.
Bonjour, professeur Stainton. Effectivement, vous étiez très, très lumineux. Donc, merci beaucoup pour votre exposé. Effectivement, comme vient de le dire mon collègue de Gouin, dans la loi québécoise, le handicap en lui-même ne donne pas ouverture à l'aide médicale à mourir et on parle vraiment de maladies graves et incurables. Par ailleurs, évidemment, une personne qui a un handicap physique ou intellectuel ou qui vit avec un trouble du spectre de l'autisme, si elle est par ailleurs apte, comme pour tout soin de santé ou pour tout refus de traitement, il va falloir l'évaluer au cas par cas, puis elle va pouvoir recevoir l'aide médicale à mourir. Ça, c'est l'état des lieux en ce moment, donc dans la loi québécoise. La question vraiment qui nous occupe, c'est celle de l'inaptitude. Donc, on part vraiment de l'inaptitude et non pas de l'élément qui amène l'inaptitude, qui est la déficience, où on créerait par exemple une catégorie spéciale pour les personnes déficientes. C'est vraiment les personnes qui sont inaptes. Et donc, on comprend toute la complexité d'évaluer à chaque fois est-ce que la personne est apte ou inapte parce que ça peut fluctuer. Mais dans un cas où la personne elle est inapte, soit parce qu'elle a une déficience très profonde, elle est inapte de naissance, elle ne peut jamais consentir à aucun soin, donc évidemment pas à l'aide médicale à mourir. Est-ce que je comprends bien que votre position, c'est de nous dire que dans un cas comme celui-là, on doit rejeter l'idée d'un consentement par une tierce personne, donc un consentement substitué, ou vous nous dites, dans un tel cas, on va devant un tribunal. C'est la nuance que je veux bien comprendre.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm just a glowing personality, I guess. Okay, as I said in the brief, personally, I just think there is way too much risk with any kind of substituted consent, and I would be very concerned if we allowed that under any circumstances. So really, I was talking about folks who, and it's difficult because according to Article 12 of the CRPD, everyone has the right to consent, and that they need the support to do that, and their will is interpreted by someone with trust. So, for example, my son, we have something called the Representation Agreement Act here, which is the one of the few acts that recognizes a supported decision maker, not a substitute, but a supported decision maker. So his mother and I are his representatives, which gives us the right to speak on his behalf in terms of healthcare consent, financial matters, those kind of things. But the duty on us is to represent his will, not to substitute his will for ours. And that's a very, very fine line and tricky. I would never want that to extend in our case or anybody's cases to an end of life decision.
Yeah. Okay. Je comprends très bien. Donc, pour vous, c'est à exclure, évidemment, toutes circonstances d'inaptitude, mais quand une personne peut être jugée apte avec du soutien, c'est là que le rôle des proches ou de la personne désignée peut entrer en ligne de compte. Et donc, si je comprends bien, quand vous avez fait allusion dans votre mémoire, dans votre présentation, à l'idée d'une instance externe comme un tribunal, c'est par exemple pour les cas où ce serait pas clair si on est face à une situation d'aptitude ou d'inaptitude, ou de pouvoir avoir un processus de décision plus solide. C'est ça que je veux creuser avec vous, parce que la question que j'ai...
Malheureusement, Madame la députée, c'est tout le temps que nous avions avec le professeur Stainton. Donc, merci beaucoup, professeur Stainton, de votre expertise, d'avoir partagé avec nous votre expertise. Et la commission suspend ses travaux le temps d'accueillir nos nouveaux invités. Merci beaucoup encore, professeur Stainton.